So I'm reading this book, Gathering the Ashes, written by Amrit Nagar, translated by Mrinal Pandey. And I found it very interesting. So for a book review, I'm going to just read from the back of the cover that it is an unusual perspective on India's first war of independence that happened in 1857. Now, most discussions on the Sepoy Mutiny, as that was called, of 1857, have centered on the roles played in it by the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, Begum Hazrat Mahal, and other sundry members of the mostly urban nobility. What remained missing was a comprehensive ground zero account of how people in the countryside experienced this unorganized rebellion and reacted to it. In 1957, 100 years after the mutiny, eminent Hindi writer Amrit Nagar set out to correct this. He traveled to villages and towns that witnessed the uprising and painstakingly gathered reminiscences and popular ballads about the revolt. Its celebrated and unsung heroes, the survivors and martyrs, and also engrossing episodes about where and how various battles were fought. Aging courtesans, bedridden octogenarians, nameless singers poured their heart out to him. The slim volume Nagar finally put together as Ghadar Ki Phool were testimony to the fact that nothing can stop the spread of a revolution whose time has come. Translated from the Hindi for the first time, Gathering the Ashes is a stirring look back at an extraordinary time in Indian history, peppered with tales of outstanding acts of heroism and of shameful cowardice, of cunning alliances and heartwarming collaborations beyond religious divides. That is, beyond religious divides. Importantly, it remains a topical book for a country that speaks anew of revolutions through dharnas, protest marches, and candlelight vigils. So, talking about Amritlal Nagar, born 1916 to 1990, was one of the most prominent Hindi writers of the 20th century, often cited as a true literary heir of Premchand, the great Indian writer. He penned over 14 novels, 13 short story collections, in addition to numerous plays, screenplays for Hindi films, and books for children. He received the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1967 for his novel Amrit or Wish, and was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 1981. Mrinal Pandey is a translator and should know a little about her. It's written out here that she's an Indian television personality and author and former editor of the Hindi daily Hindustan. She was chairperson of Prasar Bharati from 2010 to 2014 April, the apex body of official Indian broadcast media. She has authored several books, that is Devi, Tales of Goddess in Our Times, then Daughter's Daughter, then That Which Ram Hath Ordained, and the subject is Woman, My Own Witness, The Other Country, and 1957, The Real Story of the Great Uprising. So now, and of course, her translation of this particular book has been hailed by Hindustan Times as An excellent translation by Mrinal Pandey, enormously valuable, a gold mine for the history buff. 1857 is a many-faceted jewel, simultaneously a pilgrim's travelogue, war diary, as a great account, and mainstream history. And then Mint writes, Pandey's translation in a language that is contemporary without being archaic brings the reader thrillingly close to the moment. Its narrative owes much to her ability to recreate a clear, fluid idiom. And she has dedicated the book to all those who have fought successfully or otherwise for their rights and India's freedom. That's how she's dedicated the book to. And it's full of the personal accounts given by the people. So one on page 41 caught my eyes, Kursi, the village of fools. So Ghadar tales from the Chaudhary, the Maulvi, the Haji, the Khurshid, the tailor about the fleeing rebels and those that helped themselves to their gold and jewel and lived happily ever after. So I read from these pages. So I was still mulling over the tragic stories of high intrigue and betrayals that had originated in the palaces of Jahangirabad as we headed for Kursi, a village where residents have a reputation for being comical dimwits. So this is what Amrit Nagar is writing. And so he writes, a recent joke about Kursi has it that one of its residents was seen having a sharp exchange of words with his neighbor, and soon thereafter an unidentified body was recovered from the village well. One of the Kursi residents told the police constable that the dead one had to be the man who was recently seen in a nasty argument with his neighbor. The police immediately arrested the alleged perp, even though the poor fellow kept insisting that the man next door was very much alive. The police, the alleged killer, and the usual crowd of onlookers from the village landed at the police station only to discover that the allegedly murdered man was very much alive and sitting at the thana. After the people refused to listen to the entreaties of the arrested man, his alleged victim had been brought to the police station by the family of the arrested man as living proof of his undead state. The magistrate before whom the convict was presented, instead of reprimanding the local police for not verifying the death properly, had a good laugh and said with a few expletives, "Brother, this is what Kursi waters will do to your brains." To be sure, the butt of various jokes, Kursi is actually an ancient village that was earlier known as Love Kushi, after its founders, the twin sons of the legendary Lord Rama. It is said to have once been a stronghold of learned Brahmins, but by 1030 AD, when the Muslim invader Sayyid Salar Masood attacked the area, it had lost its reputation for learning and was being ruled by a king of the Bahar dynasty. The Bahars or Bahar Shivas were a caste of celebrated warriors during the medieval ages whose history is yet to be traced properly. But the stigma of Kursi being a village of buffoons is confirmed because a Mughal document of Jahangir Nama also referred to the Ahmaka e Kursi, that is, idiots of the Kursi area, it means. Ahmakana e Kursi. Located barely 16 miles from Lucknow and not being too intellectually inclined, Kursi was drawn into the whirlpool of the Ghadar somewhat reluctantly. According to the District Gazette on 12th March 1858, after the fall of Lucknow, the rebel native armies crossed the stone bridge towards Barabanki and headed north towards the Ghadar river. When word came that about 4,000 rebels had gathered at Kursi and were waiting to mount an attack on the British, the then Brigadier Hope Grant ordered his men to rush to Kursi and scatter the natives. In the early hours of 23rd March, he succeeded in driving the ranks of the rebel army into total disarray. True to its reputation, Kursi, I soon discovered, has chosen to more or less forget the nasty war fought at its doorstep. We first arrived at the house of Chaudhry Mahmud Hassan, a major land owner and the village head of Kursi. After being told of the purpose of a visit, Chaudhry Sahib said he had no idea about the involvement of his village in the Ghadar. Queries to his family retainers yielded a few names of the village octogenarians, but none of them, it seemed, were fit enough to come and meet us. Was I sure this fact was reported in the District Gazette? Chaudhry Sahib wanted to know. I told him that indeed it was, and that I wished to meet those in the age group of 70 to 80 in particular, who may have some rare legends about the Ghadar that was passed down to them by their family elders. Our man said that this was the first time that he had heard about Kursi's martyrs. But anyways, since we had trudged all the way to his house, he would accompany us to the village cleric Maulvi Sahib, who possessed many old books. The rest of the villagers are useless idiots, he added as an afterthought. The village lanes we passed through were full of old ruins bearing witness to the historical importance of the area. We settled down at the raised brick platform outside the government seed store. Soon 2 elders turned up. One of them was Haji Abdus Samad. He had a clean-shaven head, a white beard, and was dressed only in a lungi. He walked with a stoop, and his aged body and bandaged foot depended on a cane for support as he hobbled up. In a tired and barely audible whisper, he told us that the Ghadar tales he had heard were all based on hearsay, and he had forgotten most of them. We requested him to tell us whatever he could recall. Well, my mother used to say that the Goras had entered the village from the point behind the mosque where the Top Khana stood. The locals ran off towards the Mitaila as the Gora army marched in. Mitaila was a little lake at Kazibagh, about 1.5 miles from Kursi. Finally, the Goras surrounded the locals near the lake and butchered them mercilessly. My mother said that ever since that massacre, the villagers were constantly scurrying here and there to save their lives. As Haji continued his story, I noticed that about 6 others had collected at the spot. An old man, who must be a little younger than Haji Sahib, said that the British had been ruling the area even before the Ghadar. During the revolt for 3 months, the villages were vacated, and it was only later that the villagers were allowed back. Haji Sahib added that one of their family retainers, who had saved himself by diving into the Ghadar river and swimming across to the other side, reported that the rebels, having chased the British, had turned into violent thugs and spread panic among villagers. Their lawless ways made it easier for the Britishers to return to power. At this point, Khurshid Mian, the village tailor, made an appearance. He was said to be around 90 years old, but seemed to be better health than Haji Sahib. Khurshid Mian told us that the simpletons from Kursi village had indeed clashed with the Goras in Khurshidabad. They were massacred by the British soldiers in a locality known as Madarpur. The rebel native troops were chased thereafter to the Mitaila lake and finally defeated in battle. At this point, the tailor broke off and looked at Haji Mian for approval, but after he saw that the Mian kept rubbing his bald pate absent-mindedly, He continued, in those days the village had a topkhana and a permanent army contingent whose offices were located where the Chaudhry Sahib now resides. The army stayed at the topkhana, and during the Ghadar, some soldiers from the Nawab's army had also taken up residence at Qazibagh. Haji Sahib quipped that in those days the Nawab's men used to tour the area at regular intervals to inspect the crops and assess the annual taxes payable to the royal treasuries. The land in the area was all Najul category, that is, administered directly by the Nawab's representatives, and there were no zamindars here. He said that his grandfather, a short-tempered man, was once taken into the custody by the Nawab's officials and asked to do wageless labor. This made him so angry that he jumped into a dry well and said, if you want me to work for free, try to pull me out at the risk of drowning. I'd rather die than work without being paid. A leader of the Nawab's contingent, Risaldar, lived in the village. His mistress' grave can be found in the Topkhana area, Haji Sahib said. I steered the conversation back from the Risaldar's mistress to the Ghadar and asked how long the battle at Mitaila had lasted. It was over just in a day, the elders said, and lapsed into silence. It was obvious this was all they could tell us. Chaudhry Sahib now accompanied us to the house of the learned Maulvi Sahib with the library. He belonged to the family of the elder guru of the famous Saint Waris Ali Shah and lived in his ancestral house near a mosque whose origins dated back to the days of the Mughal Emperor Babur. When we reached Maulvi Sahib's house, he was being sprayed with DDT. It was being sprayed with DDT to fight malarial mosquitoes, and he was busy supervising the somewhat intricate campaign against the nasty bloodsuckers. He excused himself as we approached and welcomed us warmly. As we got talking, he told us that he knew little other than the fact that after the fall of Lucknow, when the palaces were being looted and set on fire, many begums from the deposed Nawab Wajid Ali Shah's harem had to run to Kursi to save their lives. As the poor, disoriented women ran into unknown forest areas, many became easy prey for dacoits and soldiers that lay in wait there and were subjected to many unspeakable humiliations. When they heard that the Britishers were chasing them, the royals abandoned the cartloads of gold coins and precious jewelry they had carried out of their palaces. Apparently, a man by the name of Dullu, the father of Lalu, managed to scuttle away one such cart full of gold coins from the Nawab's palace and subsequently became rich. The Maulvi Sahib had a precious collection of old handwritten religious texts in Persian and Arabic. Several of these were well-known professional calligraphers who had flourished in Lucknow under the Nawabs. Chaudhry Sahib tried to nudge him into requesting all of us to find good buyers for these precious volumes. The ample money that their sale would bring could erase all their debt and make him very rich. Would erase all his debt and make him very rich, he said. But the Maulvi Sahib had the easy nonchalance of an intellectual. Sir, he said to the Chaudhry, time takes care of such matters. Why should you and I get into all that? Well, he wills. That means God wills. And the time is right. They will sell out. They will sell on their own. It was a pleasure to meet the learned man. I noticed that his house was paved with kind of large lacquer bricks one does not see anymore. I asked him if he had them baked specially for his courtyard. He said that the house we sat in was an ancient one. It was built on a spot where an old fort of the Bahars stood earlier. During the digging, a lot of beautifully baked small and large bricks were unearthed and utilized in building the house. As we were about to leave, word came in that Haji Sahib and Khurshid Mia wished to meet us again, as they had suddenly remembered a few important facts about the Ghadar subsequent to our meeting. Aging brains often work in cycles, and perhaps talking to us about the past had triggered some dormant memories. So we retraced our steps, thanked them as we sat down once again, me with my pen hovering over paper, waiting for the two old men to speak. Haji Saab, after we left, he had suddenly recalled his mother telling him how the Begum of Awadh, when she arrived here with her young sons, Birjis Ghadar, had kept dropping little bundles containing gold coins and her fabled jewels into various wells as she moved on. He had also heard that before they decided to send him into exile, the wily British had asked Nawab Wajid Ali Shah to choose between the 12 kosas, about 35 square miles of land, or rupees 1.25 lakhs in cash as compensation for being divested of his throne. At this, his wife Begum Hazrat Mahal's reaction was, "What sort of measly compensation is this for a vast empire?" Finally, it was Wajid Ali Shah's own father-in-law and Wazir Naqvi Mian, Nawab Ali Naqvi Khan, who, as the intermediary, was responsible for making the Badshah hand his kingdom over to the British and accept the petty amount. When Prince Birjis Ghadar later questioned this act, the Badshah had said to him, "What could I do? It was your grandfather who made me give away my kingdom." The tailor Khurshid Mia recounted another story. Ganga Baksh and his son, residents of Beta village nearby, went and kidnapped a white man and his Mem Sahib. They tortured the two horribly, and it was said they even drove nails into their private parts. Later, the father and son were captured by the British and they were beheaded publicly near a nala in Lucknow, now known as Sarkata Nala. I then asked if anyone had heard about natives looting or torturing their natives during Ghadar. Khurshid Mia said that the Begums of Awadh were robbed repeatedly when they were on the run to save their lives. A man named Dulu apparently hijacked a bullock cart loaded with precious gold and gems belonging to the Begums. "Was it the same Dulu, father to one Lalu?" I asked. Yes, he was Lalu's father. I thanked the two gentlemen profusely and left. After that, I met Asghar Ali, an octogenarian living in Tobkhana Mohalla. He pointed out to us that the near extinct graves of the then commander's favorite notch girls and a few crumbling watchtowers. As we were about to leave, he mentioned that his father had told him how Begum Hazrat Mahal had sought shelter in Bundi village when the British came. Was there looting here during the Ghadar? I asked. No, we were told that when the soldiers arrived here, the villagers had already escaped into forests with all their belongings. Thus, Makan e Kursi. So that's how it goes. There are so many other villages. He went to so many villages, so many places, and then we come to this views of the author, the translator. It's a translator's note that I'm going to read. That is Mrinal Pandey. So I'm just going to read here. Nagarji has not tried to record the historic sequence of the popular revolt as it unfurled in Awadh. He tries instead to jog public memory through stories that have multiple narrators and speak polyphonically. In the process, he brings to the surface acts of collective defiance and individual bravery, tales of loyalty and betrayals, sung and unsung folk heroes and villains and their roles in the complex matrix of the Ghadar. It was a time when all native structures were being deliberately discredited and pulled down by an alien power, and oral narratives had become the preferred mode for preserving and transmitting the history of the vanquished. Nagarji's work highlights the historical processes of dispossession and its backlash while exploring the popular character of this unique public uprising. It helps us see, much more than any formal academic treatise, how the defeated side perceives victory and loss, and how some, like the nameless fakir at Ramnagar village, simply refuse to accept the inevitable and sheath their swords. Loyalty and betrayal are here described against the age-old standards of namak halali, that means being true to your salt provider, and namak harami, betraying ones whose salt you have eaten. Public memory guarantees that namak harams of the Ghadar, such as Wazir Naki Mia, Raja Roshan Ali, and Raja Man Singh, would always be remembered in rural Awadh as Gaddars. And even after a century, their homes shall be pointed out to the visitors as Gaddaro ke ghar, that is, homes of those who betrayed their masters. In telling these tales, Amrit Lal Nagar chose to lean on the ancient Indian oral tradition. As the Katha Vachak, that is, teller of tales, he can assume a dual role, one as a teller of the narrative and two of a creative writer who can afford to step in occasionally to insert his own reflections upon the times, and while at it also insert a few tales of his own. We constantly see the teller and the listener swapping roles, casually digressing from pure Hindi prose into Awadhi songs. Often they pause together and savor a particularly good joke or shake their hands in awe over some grim curse that had destroyed a whole family or a royal line. On occasion, even the certifiably dead may simply refuse to fall down after being decapitated and return to the battlefield at night riding their ghostly steed, demanding that a shopkeeper hand them a roll of bran. Seasoned Indian audience will not find this format too strange or unsettling, given their famous argumentative capabilities. They are content with and even admire stories that recreate a complex world through point and counterpoint. There is trust that all complexities can be handled skillfully by a good storyteller, and that as listeners they are free to interrupt and cap on incident with a similar one, and join the narrator in song, clap to keep time, and spontaneously invoke God's name at all particularly moving junctures in the tale. Everyday poetry flows from the mouths of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, barbers, sellers of perfumes, gardeners, erstwhile princes, landlords, and priests. Mendu Khan, a local wit, when warned by the police officials about his imminent hanging, replies, "You will see, sir, I shall come out of the case as a honey bee from a pot of honey. You will see." Stay for lunch, a lonely dowager in her tumble-down rural fortress says coquettishly to the great hero Rana Veni Madhav Baksh Singh, who is about to leave for the battlefield, "If you do not eat our royal repast, we shall chop off your horses' tails before you leave here." "But of course, Aji, grandmother," says the affable Rana, and sits down for what is perhaps his last royal meal in a kitchen about to be demolished with a shelling from British cannons. Still smiling, the Roger Queen is carried off to safety a little later by two burly soldiers from the Rana's army as the British rush into her fortress, while a little nameless girl gravely predicts to the Rana, "Do not worry, this battle is not going to be lost." Like most regional writers, Amrit Lal Nagar is a listener of local history, as also a witness and storyteller. He can maintain the objectivity of writing in English, but lets on that he is too deeply moved by the stories not to take sides. Images of love and longing, death and bereavement, royalty and loyalty and betrayal are unfurled in the tale after tale without moralizing. Even delightful trivia, an invaluable pearl necklace given to the Kashmiri family in Faizabad, gets left behind during the Ghadar riot, and the young son resorts to fake lunacy to re enter the town, torn apart by riots, and manages to retrieve and depart to the forest with the priceless family jewels tucked in his muddied loincloth, begins to glow and emit a strange light when set against the backdrop of a true public rebellion. The Jekyll and Hyde characters too are viewed sympathetically. Lone Singh, the opportunistic Raja of Mitholi, the sadist Rao Ram Baksh Singh of village Dundia Kheda, and Farzand Ali, son-in-law of Raja Razak Ali, who ensures his rise like a male model today, using sex, guile, and treachery. Then there is the touching tale of conjugal misery from the village of Katwara, where the ruler's alienated wife ceased to speak to her husband long before her death and willed that she be buried with the family pets but not her husband. A wall was erected between the two graves within the mausoleum, and the wife was buried near the graves of Khan Bahadur's favorite dogs, parrots, and nightingales. What stories these graves hide! The sequence of events and battles varies from village to village. After 100 years, half a dozen versions of the battles fought at village Ruya and Semri and Manwa Ka Kot are doing the rounds. The exact route taken by Begum Hazrat Mahal's entourage as she came to attend the Princess Conclave at Bundi, or later when she and some of her royal talukdars escape into Nepal, are also hotly debated. Even the officially announced deaths of venerable heroes such as Nana Sahib of Bithur or Rana Veni Madhav Baksh Singh are laid open to doubt because there are stories from multiple quarters about some mysterious sadhu fakir suddenly sacrificing in a far-off place, and villagers swearing upon holy books that they were none other than Nana Sahib or the Rana in disguise. A frequently asked question was, why did the Indians massacre so many white men, women, and children so ruthlessly during the Ghadar? Why indeed? As Inayat Hussain of Sultanpur tells the author, because the whites had killed the natives just as ruthlessly. It's a close circle of revenge that these stories from rural Awadh unfurl before us. Poor families and their families, mercenaries, soldiers, artisans, courtesans, and prostitutes, sick of their exploited lives, wordlessly suffering under both the Nawabs and the British, chose to go with the native offensive when the opportunity presented itself. As the native side lost, the urge to pillage, loot, and burn, to knock down the whole goddamn chessboard, no matter how ill-tempered and vulgar, was immense. You cannot win the game, so why not overturn the board, pawns and king and queen and all? The reorganization of Awadh that followed the suppression of the Ghadar is usually seen as another necessary step in the direction of unification and modernization of a backward land divided by its ancient traditions and ethnic strife. But another question several of the stories raise is Ghadar ke Phool has seldom been answered. How did the traditional Indian police and courts locate and implement the British laws in their cultural world? Was that our ancestors lost, or were they survived by lying or betraying their own? Do not make for an appropriate subject for discussion in the presence of the younger generation. The terror, the guilt, the shame, the vulnerability, those memories may trigger off. Must not wisdom goes be allowed to be passed down generation after generation? Hence, the excuses given repeatedly to the writer about how written family records, the letters the rebels wrote to each other, and the formal firmans sent by the Queen of Awadh while on run have not survived. Many talk frankly about how the fear of British Reprisals loomed long after the Ghadar had been quelled, and fathers or grandfathers were sent out with when eyewitnesses in the families talked of Ghadar. Ghadar Ke Phool also gives graphic detail about the post 1857 reprisals visited upon the rebels. Many were hideously tortured and killed by the victorious British forces. Lands of rebel Rajas were confiscated and many were executed or exiled to the Andamans. Villagers who were suspected of having helped or harbored the rebel leaders as they fled were forced to vacate their ancestral villages and their meager crops were destroyed. As a writer, Nagar realized just as no political power on earth can stop history mutating into family lore, folk literature too cannot be prevented from choosing and immortalizing certain heroes and villains, even 100 years after the Ghadar had been brutally suppressed and most records expunged from the public arena. Stories and ballads about local martyrs, their acts of bravery and betrayal continue to be transmitted through illiterate wandering poets, clerics, priests, and of course mothers and grandmothers. So we come across amazing cameos of little known or unknown men and women that challenge our fixed notions of survival and sacrifice in an age when everything seems to sway and crumble. We meet, many of us, for the first time, almost unknown rural level leaders: Raja Devi Baksh Singh, Raja Veni Madho Raja, Haridat Thakur, Balbhadra Singh, the Rani of Tulsipur, ordinary farmers and barbers and potters, courtesans and mercenary sepoys from hundreds of villages like Akuna, Charkhari, Marwedi, Rehua, Tifada, and Bhinaga and Chintat. One of the most interesting features of this remarkable compilation is a key role repeatedly played by a few spunky women who discarded the veil and led armies of rebels during the Ghadar. In the 19th century, women's wrath, even that of queens, seemed to have had few acceptable uses, but in Ghadar Ke Phool we repeatedly hear stories like that link Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi, and her Muslim counterparts Begum Hazrat Mahal of Awadh and the daughter queen of Awadh, Janab-e-Liya Taj-Ara Begum, mother of the deposed Nawab Wajid Ali Shah. She chose to sail all the way to London to meet the Queen and ask for a restoration of her son's unjustly confiscated kingdom. In these three mothers, we meet women that may have spent their lives within the four walls of some royal harem, but as their aging or ailing men begin to look for easy compromises or die long and lingering deaths, these women quietly step forward and assume charge. True, most rightful shedding of blood on battlefields is still reserved for men, but as persons in charge of the fate of millions, these mothers have full moral and cultural authority for the natives to lead men into intricate political negotiations and, if need be, into bloody battles. As an imprisoned Nawab pours his heart out to his estranged wives in verse, fierce Telangas roam the streets. Rebels are crushed under road rollers, tied to cannons and blown apart as landlords lose or gain ancestral lands. Fleeing queens bury their jewels in abandoned wells, shell forts, temples and mosques, and mothers send sons to war saying, "I waive the price of my breast milk." We realize now, despite the forced price of his travels and paucity of necessary equipment such as a digital camera or voice recorder, a good writer can gather hitherto buried stories and gently lend history a minimalist and graceful design that focuses not so much on the flow of events but on how they impacted people and changed lives. War and its companions, heroism and cowardice, have haunted India ever since the hordes of the West rode across its borders. What happened to the people of Awadh has also been happening to other people in other countries in our times, and we may be sure will continue to happen. One begs to answer the question, therefore, how and when do the long vanquished and meek people suddenly stand up to their tormentors, reassert their dignity, never mind the price they must pay? What is a collective wisdom that makes them accept defeat temporarily only to resurface defiantly almost a century later? Just as the needle's eye may usher one into heaven, these stories from 100 terror-mirrored eyes will let the reader directly into the heart of 1857, a year that was great and sick at the same time, a year that what's and all was to be the crucible for India's struggle for independence in the 20th century, that rather than the ruthless march of an alien superpower and the true takeaway from this gentle, loving and sorrowful gathering of the ashes of Awadh's Ghadar. And then she writes as a son remembers, son of Amritlal Nagar, his name Dr. Sharad Nagar. So stories about Ghadar, the great Indian uprising, he writes, of 1857 had obsessed my father ever since he was a child. He used to tell us how when he was staying with his grandfather at Allahabad, each night they would hear the howling of jackals coming from the park outside their house. Mata Din, their old family retainer, told them that this area used to be a thriving bazaar, but the British butchered many after the Ghadar, that means the uprising. After the massacre, the whole area was razed and bulldozed, and it is believed that the howls they heard came not from the jackals, but the unhappy souls of those that had lived there once upon a time. My father's grandmother also told him many stories about those disturbed times. And my father, grandmother had discovered an avid listener of their stories. Stories such as how her own grandfather had left home after a trip with his wife during the Ghadar, and then her grandmother's father had rushed out to search for his missing son-in-law. Another source of Ghadar tales, father said, was an old watchman known as Thakur. Apparently, his whose body trembled as he recounted hair-raising stories from the mutiny, and his face would turn red in anger. In 1944, when father was in Bombay, his friend and admirer, the Marathi writer Shyam Rao Neelkant Oak, presented him a copy of Maja Pravas, My Journey, by Vishnu Bhatt Godse Varsaikar, a travelogue by a Marathi Brahmin who had witnessed the Ghadar during a visit up north in 1857. Father was so enchanted by that book that he wrote to his closest friend, the Hindi writer Dr. Ramvilas Sharma, that he had to translate it into Hindi so that the friends like Dr. Sharma would also read the rare memories of an ordinary traveler. He shared the completed manuscript of the Hindi translation with Dr. Sharma, who was equally enchanted with the first ever record of the great historic rebellion, even though it was written by a simple Marathi beggar. 5 years later, it was published by the great art historian Rai Krishnadas's publishing house as Mera Pravas, and then reprinted in 1963 from Lucknow under the title Aankho Dekha Ghadar, and a third edition was later published by New Delhi-based Rajpal and Sons. In April 1956, my father resigned from his job with All India Radio. He had been somewhat uneasy with the ever-increasing pressures of being a salaried servant of the government, but with the source of a regular income gone, the going got tough for him and his family. Once again, his most recent novel was very well received, and boosted by this surge of confidence, by January 1957, father had begun planning a trilogy on the Ghadar. As the idea grew, he realized that one had to do some field work and gather fresh and original material directly from the source, the villages of Awadh, where most of the battles had been fought in 1857. He wrote to Dr. Ramvilas Sharma, getting more and more obsessed with the idea of traveling to as many villages of Awadh as he could to tap public memory and gather whatever stories, ballads, and memories about the Ghadar that had survived. To him, it would be like gathering the ashes after a loved one's cremation, he said. When he discussed this with his friend Bhagwati Sharan Singh, the Director for Information and Publicity for the government of UP, he was enchanted. He urged my father to leave without losing time and promised to provide him with a basic minimum aji for traveling, a district level official to take him around. In return, he made father promise that he would hand over a complete manuscript based on his field notes by September, which could be eventually published as a handbook during the centenary year of the Ghadar. For his efforts, father was told he would receive a total amount of 1,000 rupees as advance royalty. Father immediately came home and told Ba, my mother, of his proposal. Ba was happy at the thought of my father's story gathering efforts being facilitated by a government grant that would go on to produce an additional handbook. What also pleased her was that the thought that the 1,000 rupees father would get as advance royalty would considerably ease the financial pressure our joint family had been undergoing ever since father resigned from government service. Father told Ba that his travels would be rushed and involve at least 3 major forays to various places. She should pack his bags accordingly. Ba had knitted a beautiful jute bag for carrying father's clothes when he had travelled to Chennai in 1946. The bag was taken out and found space larger enough for 3 to 4 changes of father's clothes, his books, and last but not the least, his precious box of pan. On 4th June 1957, father left for the first lap of his travels to Barabanki. Father carried no tape recorder camera that could have facilitated his gathering of the material. We simply could not afford them, and the Department of Information and Publicity did not consider providing him with any of these. My father's childhood friend, Gyan Chandra Jain, who was then working for a Hindi daily, Dainik Navjeevan, presented him with a precious sheaf of foolscap paper and a few small notebooks for taking notes during the travels. To his cash shave, father added a few pencils, a pencil sharpener, a pen, and a couple more school notebooks. His arsenal thus completed, father left for home to tour and survey the villages of Awadh. He was dressed as usual in a simple pair of cotton kurta pajama and a pair of slippers. Father's 3-day trip to Barabanki ended on 7 June. During this period, he visited the villages of Daryabad, Bhayara, Jahangirabad, Kursi, and Mahadeva. Thereafter, between 8 and 9 June, he toured the districts of Sultanpur and Faizabad. The second lap began on 15 June and lasted for 3 days. During this period, he toured the district of Bahraich and Gonda, and then from 26 to 28 June, he toured the district of Sitapur. After visiting 6 districts, my father returned home and began working on the chapters using his handwritten notes for reference. He was very excited about the material he had collected, in particular, the role played by the weakest part of the Indian society, its women. He was fascinated by the great organizational capabilities that a Parda-bound Begum Hazrat Mahal had shown as a leader of the rebel forces. In a letter to his dearest friend, the great scholar Dr. Ramvilas Sharma, father wrote, I wish to understand the society which was the crucible for the Ghadar, in particular the biggest social problem that stared in face, the caste system and casteism. Even at a time when the Ghadar is challenging the system, I find the caste becoming more powerful, more rigid, in particular where the marriage system is concerned. The caste system's intricacies make it almost impossible to trace its simple and basic contours. It feels as though we are looking at the country through a moving body of water. Brother, queens like Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi and Begum Hazrat Mahal of Lucknow, along with courtesans of Kanpur, ordinary housewives in Awadh, Bundelkhand and Jagdishpur, could not have taken to streets under ordinary circumstances. Who knows what prolonged oppressions they were out to avenge. The Ghadar gave them an opportunity and almost overnight turned them into aggressive Durgas lusting for battles. Many years later, once while straightening my father's papers at home, I came across some field notes of Ghadar ke Phool scribbled on a sheaf of foolscape paper and a school notebook. Where is the completed manuscript? I wanted to know. Father said that he did not have either the time or the money to have this manuscript typewritten, and producing another handwritten copy for his personal records would have been both tedious and time-consuming. Since the State Department of Information and Publicity was keen to publish the book during the centenary year of the Ghadar, he decided to keep forwarding the handwritten chapters one by one to the publishers to facilitate printing within the given time span. What corrections he had made could be made on the proofs rushed to him by the publishers. There was thus no complete manuscript available. The notes taken down hastily in pen by father while he heard the tellers recount the stories are all nearly illegible by now. I once asked him why he had scribbled them in pencil. He said that he liked to watch and record the faces and gestures of the storytellers as they spoke. He had therefore perfected the art of writing without looking down at the notepads as he jotted his notes. In his experience, a pencil ran on its own, unlike a fountain pen that could suddenly run out of ink and was therefore preferable. Each time he returned, he would sit down immediately to make a fair copy in ink using those hastily penciled notes, which was then rushed to the publishers. I must mention here that father wrote a beautiful discursive hand, and even if he wrote on a plain piece of paper, his lines ran without dipping down or coursing upwards. This fact must have made his proofreaders happy. On 11 July, father left Lucknow again and headed for the district of Raebareli. He was thereafter planning to tour the districts of Unnao and Hardoi, but unusually heavy monsoon rains put his plans to rest. This made him quite upset, and he already regretted his inability to have toured these two areas. Meanwhile, the Department of Information and Publicity that had facilitated his travels was getting restless and wanted him to complete and hand them the manuscript of publication as soon as possible. Father sat down to write the remaining chapters on 21st July 1957 and managed to complete the job within a month on 16 September. He dedicated this book to the young martyr, the Raja of Chahlari, then Balbhadra Singh, and 600 Hindus and Muslims who had laid down their lives to liberate their motherland from foreign occupation. So, well, that's the book, and really it's a great book to read. There's so much you'll find, wealth of history about the time the Ghadar took place. So, gathering the and as they've written, the translation is by Mrinal Pandey, is absolutely fascinating.
Karo double tap. Recorder.
कितना हो गया? 8 मिनट
54 minutes.
वाह, बस ठीक करके डाल दे. मेरी तो आँखें इतना मतलब
वो पेंसिल डाल दो.
डाल देगा ना अब मेरा?
भेज दूंगा, सुबह अपलोड कर लेना.
अपलोड तो कर दे.